Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing the Public Charge Rule, a U.S. immigration policy that determines whether immigrants may be denied permanent residency if they're considered likely to become a dependent on public government assistance. While the policy technically only applies to certain individuals and public benefits, research has consistently found that it impacts beyond the people it legally targets. For this episode, I wanted to hear from someone who has experienced immigration firsthand. I'm joined by my friend Elena, an Iranian-American woman who immigrated to the U.S. with her family. Throughout our conversation, I'll be using the Intersectionality-Based Policy Analysis Framework, or IBPA. This framework encourages us to understand how intersectionality shapes people's lives. Before we begin, I also want to acknowledge my own perspective. As a U.S. citizen, I don't have lived experience navigating the immigration system, and while I've spent time researching this policy, I recognize that lived experience offers a perspective that can't be captured through academia. One of the guiding principles of BPA is centering voices that are often excluded from policy conversations, which are ironically the voices that these policies impact most. Elena, thank you so much for joining me today and taking the time to discuss your experience.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with you.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and your family's experience immigrating to the U.S.?
Yeah, absolutely. I am 28. I immigrated here with my family when I was almost 2 years old, so I have grown up here in America. My father came here first in the early 70s as a student. He did a student transfer program, came in on a student visa, eventually got his citizenship. In the 80s, he went to Iran, married my mom, and brought her here, so she came under a marriage visa, which then led her to get her citizenship. And then in 99 is when they went back and adopted me and brought me to the States under their citizenship status. So I had a green card for the majority of my life, and then when I turned 18, I applied for U.S. citizenship myself and became a citizen.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I know you mentioned that your parents immigrated under very different financial circumstances. Can you talk a little bit about how money influenced each of their experiences?
Absolutely. When my father was here as a student, he lived the typical student experience where you don't have much and you're making it by the skin of your teeth. But he eventually got his degree and started his own business selling cars. So he had I guess a different experience than some immigrants do in terms of finances, and when him and my mom were together, she got to live under his financial standing, but they got divorced in 2002, so then my mom had to live as a single mother with basically negative money and try to figure out the immigrant lifestyle with low income, which happens to be quite challenging for many people, immigrant or not, but given the lack of resources and education on her end, it did become quite a difficult journey to secure finances for her and her daughter, daycare, food. We lived on food stamps. I did free and reduced lunch program through school. We found different childcare companies that would help low-income families. So there was definitely a huge barrier between her and this life, this dream American life that they show you as an immigrant.
Yeah, one thing that immediately stands out from your story is that immigration isn't experienced through just one identity. Instead, your experience is reflecting how gender, ethnicity, class, and family power dynamics have intersected to shape the opportunities and challenges available to each of you. And this intersectionality is exactly what BPA asks us to recognize. Many people have probably heard of the term public charge, but understanding what it actually means and why it's become so controversial is a bit more complex. As immigration attorneys at Song & Associates explain, public charge policies aren't unique to the U.S. Many countries have some version of the policy that's intended to determine whether prospective immigrants will be financially self-sufficient. In the U.S., public charge laws weren't clearly defined until 1999, when it referred primarily to people who were dependent on government cash assistance or long-term institutional care. That changed, however, during the Trump administration when it expanded to include programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and housing assistance. So although those changes were later reversed under the Biden administration in 2022, researchers have found that the fear surrounding the policy has remained. And one thing that stands out to me is that immigration officers don't make decisions based on one specific factor. They're using what they're calling a holistic approach, weighing factors like a person's age, health, family size, education, income, to determine whether someone might be a public charge in the future on a case-by-case basis. According to American Immigration Lawyers Association, this broad discretion means that applicants can never be entirely sure how their case is going to be interpreted. I'm thinking about the reasons behind the reality that immigrant families are afraid to access healthcare, food assistance, and other services that keep them healthy and stable. Research consistently shows that the uncertainty built into this policy has created tremendous fear amongst immigrants. Also understanding that not everyone experiences that uncertainty in the same way. Factors like financial resources, family support, and language all shape how much risk someone feels they can take. That's where the intersectionality of the embedded uncertainty in our public charge reform becomes clear, and an intersectional lens becomes especially important. I'm curious what you think about that. If your family were undergoing the immigration process now, had they needed programs like Medicaid and food assistance during the immigration process, do you think concerns about immigration status would have influenced their decisions?
Absolutely. I think that people underestimate the horrors and oppression that people are running from when they immigrate. And so they will do anything not to risk getting sent back to what they believe is the worst possible conditions. So if that means not getting health care or housing, they would rather try and make the best life that they can under those circumstances than go back home. And I think that if the immigration status were ever to be taken away, that would be the worst of it all. So that's why they're willing to risk those things.
Mm-hmm. Those are great points. One of the most significant consequences of public charge, I think, is something researchers call the chilling effect. Research has found that even immigrants who aren't actually subject to public charge have often delayed or avoided health care, food assistance, and other social services because they fear it could negatively impact their immigration status in the future, which is what I think you're speaking to. One study estimated that during the COVID-19 pandemic, over 2 million essential workers avoided enrolling in Medicaid, and more than 1 million immigrants gave up their SNAP benefits because of concerns surrounding the public charge rule. One group that researchers have found has especially impacted by the policy have been pregnant immigrant women. A study conducted in New York found that after the proposed expansion of the public charge rule, non-citizen mothers delayed enrolling in Medicaid and entered prenatal care later in pregnancy. Researchers also found fewer prenatal visits overall, particularly outside of New York City, where immigrant outreach and community resources were more limited. Studies like this highlight how this problem disproportionately impacts immigrant women. I'd love to hear your take on this. Why do you think someone would choose to go without health care or food assistance instead of risking their immigration status?
Well, like I mentioned before, I think that it's the lesser of two evils to go without healthcare, food assistance in the States rather than be deported back home and have to face the horrors that they were running away from in the first place. And specifically speaking on parents or mothers and expecting mothers, if the option is getting to have your baby in the United States and that baby have secured immigration status, at least for the time being, then that is worth anything not to risk getting sent back home. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially when you put it like the lesser of two evils. As a social work student, one of the things that stood out to me while researching this topic has been that many of these harms are preventable, and I think what you're describing also highlights something that's easy to overlook. Researchers found that immigrant women living in New York City experienced fewer negative health impacts than women living in suburban or rural areas, largely because New York City invested in community outreach, public education, and partnerships with trusted immigrant organizations. Another study examining trauma-informed care for migrant women reached a similar conclusion. The research has found that many women encounter structural barriers to accessing healthcare, including language barriers, limited knowledge and available services, fear of stigma, and uncertainty about confidentiality. They argued that improving access includes ensuring services are culturally sensitive, trauma-informed, and connected to trusted community organizations. When communities build trust and make services easier to access, immigrant women are far more likely to seek the care and support they need. So if I could recommend changes to this policy, they would focus less on individuals and more on the system surrounding them. First, they should be clear and transparent so families aren't left guessing how decisions will be made. Government should invest in culturally responsive education and outreach. And lastly, healthcare systems should adopt trauma-informed approaches when working with immigrant families to promote environments built on trust, cultural sensitivity, confidentiality, and respect for their lived experiences. All social welfare providers and organizations should work collaboratively to reduce fear before it becomes a barrier to care. Before we wrap up, if you could change one thing about the immigration system for families like yours, what would it be?
I think the most important, or from our perspective of immigrating to a city, well, first like Gadsden, Alabama, which is truly a rural town, and then moving to Nashville, Tennessee, you're going to have different availability of resources compared to bigger, more liberal cities like New York or Chicago or LA. So I think if everything that you mentioned, absolutely, and being able to expand those into more suburban and rural areas where a lot of immigrants do happen to go due to the of ease of access, or not, how do I say? Sometimes it's easier to live in more suburban and rural places due to your income status, but then being able to expand those resources into those areas would create a more well-rounded immigrant community, I believe.
That's a really great point. Thank you so much for sharing your story today. The public charge rule is often framed as an economic policy, but when we take a closer look, we can see how it shapes access to healthcare, influences family decisions, and creates very different experiences depending on someone's gender, race, economic background, and status. Your story reminds us that immigrants aren't one homogenous group, and policies shouldn't treat them that way.